He didn't ask for much, just a moment with a rifle he once carried through war. But they laughed at his limp, called him Grandpa, and told him to leave. He walked out in silence. What they didn't know, that silence had weight. Exactly 1 hour later, 12 Navy SEALs showed up. No noise, no threats. Just one question: where is he? Welcome to TrueKind Stories. Before we dive into this powerful story of sacrifice, silence, and brotherhood, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And if you believe respect is earned quietly, hit that subscribe button. These stories matter. On the dusty outskirts of Yuma, Arizona, nestled between an old auto repair garage and a forgotten diner, stood a weathered gun shop with sun-faded signage and tinted windows. It wasn't the kind of place you visited for friendly service. It was a place built on image, the kind that whispered authority rather than shouted it. At exactly 10:27 a.m., the bell above the door jingled softly as Ethan Marshall, a 74-year-old veteran, stepped inside. His boots were scuffed, jeans worn thin at the knees, and his olive-drab field jacket looked older than most of the rifles on display. Tucked low over his weathered face was a faded cap embroidered with a Navy SEAL's insignia. The gold trident barely visible beneath years of wear. Inside, racks of gleaming weapons lined the walls like trophies, and two young clerks behind the counter barely glanced up from their phones. Ethan didn't speak. He simply walked to the display case and placed his hand gently on the glass where an M14 sat behind the counter like a memory locked away. He wasn't there for trouble. He was there for something simple, a moment of honor, a quiet reconnection with his past, and perhaps, just perhaps, a tiny bit of respect. "Can I help you with something?" Sir, the younger clerk asked, barely looking up from his phone. His voice was more of a formality than genuine interest. Ethan gave a soft nod. "Just wondering if you still carry the M14 replica from the back wall. The old Woodstock model. I'm not looking to fire it, just wanted to hold it again." The clerk blinked. "That's a collector's piece," he said, with a smirk. "Not really something we hand over to just anyone." The veteran didn't flinch. "I used to carry one across the highlands of Nicaragua. I think I can manage a few minutes in a showroom." A second clerk, slightly older but just as dismissive, chimed in with a chuckle. "Might throw your back out. Old man, this ain't a museum." The words didn't cut deep, they didn't have to. They weren't meant to injure, just to diminish. But that's what hurt more. There was no recognition, no honor. Just the assumption that this man, with his limp and old jacket, was irrelevant. Ethan didn't protest. He didn't argue. He simply nodded once and turned to leave. There was something powerful in his silence, not the kind born of weakness, but of restraint. Of someone who had seen more than they could ever explain, and knew better than to waste breath where it wouldn't be heard. Outside, the desert sun bore down. Ethan walked back toward the edge of town, alone again. Just as he had arrived. Behind him, the clerks laughed and went back to scrolling through their feeds, unaware of what they'd just discarded. But they weren't alone. Near the ammo shelf, a woman mid-30s, gym shirt and cap pulled low, had been watching. Her name was Scarlett Hayes, a former military medic turned EMT. She hadn't said a word during the exchange, but her eyes had caught the insignia on Ethan's cap. She had seen men like him in the field, silent warriors, never asking for praise, but always carrying the cost of their sacrifice. She stepped outside 2 minutes later, pulled out her phone, and made a single call. "He was there," she said, and ended the call. At 11:28 a.m., the parking lot outside the gun shop began to fill. One matte black SUV pulled up, then another, then a third. They didn't blast music, they didn't shout, but their presence said everything. The engines hummed like coiled nerves. At 11:43 a.m., 12 men stepped out in unison, some in plain clothes, others in uniform. No words, no stares, just the unmistakable bearing of the Navy SEALs. They moved toward the store like a tide controlled, heavy with purpose. It wasn't a show. It wasn't about revenge. It was about something deeper. Respect. The bell above the door chimed again, but this time it didn't sound ordinary. It was softer, somehow heavier. The kind of sound that didn't just mark an entrance, it marked a reckoning. 12 men filed into the gun shop, their boots echoing on the tile floor, their formation deliberate. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their very presence filled the room with something intangible honor, aged and worn but undeniable. A presence born from shared sacrifice and a code deeper than words. The youngest clerk? Leo looked up from his phone and greeted them with a casual, "What can I help you with today?" "Gents." His voice trailed off as he saw the formation silent. Unmoving. Eyes locked on him like they were scanning a target. Not a price tag. The man at the front stepped forward. His chest bore ribbons and a Navy SEAL's trident that hadn't been polished for show, but dulled from time. His voice came low and clear. "An hour ago," he said, "one of us walked through that door." Leo glanced nervously at Connor, who shifted uncomfortably. "Look, sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding." The SEAL held up one hand. Not a threat, not a warning, just enough to stop the noise. He didn't come to be recognized. He continued, didn't ask for discounts, didn't even speak his name. He came for a memory, a rifle he carried through Nicaragua, Vietnam, places you've only seen in video games. And you laughed at him. The room went quiet. Even the low hum of country music seemed to fade. Then, the SEAL reached into his jacket and pulled out a scorched patch, an old American flag, folded, singed, and brittle. He placed it gently on the glass counter. "He pulled this off my shoulder while I bled out in Kandahar," the man said. "Carried me 6 miles through hell with no comms, no backup, and a bullet in his gut. Never told anyone. Never asked for a medal. He pointed to the patch, but he gave me this. And when he walked into this shop today, all he wanted was respect. You gave him mockery." A second SEAL stepped forward, placed a photo next to the patch. 8 men in desert fatigues, arms slung over one another's shoulders, dust-covered, exhausted but smiling. Right in the middle was Ethan Marshall, younger, but unmistakably the same man, a veteran, not of stories, but of action, of consequence. Connor stared at the photo. Eyes wide. I didn't know. We didn't know who he was. "Exactly," the lead SEAL replied, nodding. "You didn't ask." And with that, the 12 men turned, walking out the way they came, leaving only silence. A scorched flag, and a photo that now felt heavier than any weapon in the shop. A new kind of silence filled the room, the kind that only comes when honor reclaims its space. By 1:15 p.m., the image had already started spreading first among veteran forums, then to local Facebook groups. It wasn't a video. It wasn't loud or theatrical, indeed. Just a single photo, 12 Navy SEALs standing inside a small-town gun shop. Unmoving. Eyes locked on 2 stunned clerks behind the counter. No shouting, no fists, only presence. The caption read, "When you disrespect one of them, you answer to all of them." The reactions came fast and relentless. At first, no one knew who the old man was, but then, in a comment thread buried beneath the post, someone asked, "Does anyone know the name of the veteran they were standing for?" That's when everything changed. A woman named Isabella, who worked at the local DMV, recognized the faded SEAL team insignia on his cap. "That's Ethan Marshall. He comes in twice a year, pays in cash, always polite. Never said a word about himself." More replies followed. "My uncle said Ethan saved his life in '87, never wanted a thank you. Just walked off after dropping him at base." Another user uploaded a yellowed photo of a declassified personnel file. Chief Special Warfare Operator Ethan Thomas Marshall. SEAL Team 5, joined 1968, retired 2006. Decoration Silver Star, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, multiple unlisted commendations. No interviews, no book deals, just decades of sacrifice and silence. By 2:45 p.m., a local news station ran a brief segment titled 12 Men Stand for One Silent Tribute Shakes Small Town. The story gave no sensationalist edge. It didn't have to. The silence in that photo said more than 1,000 headlines. Back inside the shop, the clerks hadn't spoken to each other since the team left. The display counter still held the patch and the photograph. Neither man dared touch them. For the first time, Leo realized the man they mocked wasn't just some old guy. He was a walking archive of a war no one talked about anymore. A ghost made of flesh, who had come not for praise but to feel the cold steel of a memory. The weight of their mistake crushed the room. Customers trickled in throughout the day not to shop, but to stand. One elderly woman placed a single carnation beside the patch. A young man, wearing a National Guard t-shirt, saluted the photo before walking out, in silence. The shop owner, Matthew, who hadn't been present during the incident, arrived just after 3 p.m. Wordless. He walked behind the counter, removed the M14 from the glass case, and placed it beside the photograph. Then he took out a frame, scribbled a line on a torn receipt, and slid it into view. He carried it once. We'll carry the memory now. In a place once run by noise and image, honor had returned without permission, without fanfare, and it wasn't leaving anytime soon. By the time dusk settled over the town, the once-forgotten gun shop had become something else entirely. People didn't show up to browse or buy. They came to reflect, to stand before a photo and a scorched patch that had become a monument to a man most of them had passed a dozen times without a second glance. They came in silence. Some stayed minutes. Others stood for hours. And every single one left changed. Local veterans were the first to arrive. One by one, they entered quietly, nodded to the photo of Ethan Marshall, and left small tokens unit patches, challenge coins, dog tags. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken honor. A kind you couldn't fake, couldn't demand. It had to be earned. And Ethan had earned it 1,000 times over. The story, now shared across forums, social pages, and even whispered in school hallways, wasn't about a confrontation. It wasn't about a viral moment. It was about a shift one that made people stop and ask questions they hadn't thought of in years. Who do we walk past each day without knowing what they carry? What does respect look like when it's not trending? At Lou's place, the small diner near the town square, things had shifted too. The same back booth where Ethan sat every morning with his black coffee had gone from ignored to sacred. People who had once glanced past now paused, nodded, acknowledged his presence. A few even offered to pay for his coffee. He declined every time, with a quiet smile and a shake of the head. He didn't want attention. He wanted peace. And yet, the quiet veteran who never spoke of his service had become a living reminder of what this country sometimes forgets, that the people who built the foundation of its freedom rarely ask for recognition, but they always deserve it. Teachers at the local high school began reworking their history curriculum. One class read aloud the post about the Navy SEALs who stood silently for Ethan. Another wrote letters to their own relatives in service, some of whom hadn't heard from family in years. The gun shop itself changed. The display counter was updated with a glass frame bearing the words, "In memory of the man we overlooked." And the 12 who reminded us, it wasn't a business move. It was a responsibility. And Ethan? He never once acknowledged the moment publicly. He never returned to the shop. But at 5:42 a.m. every morning, his silhouette could still be seen walking the dirt road along the ridge. Same pace, same cap, same silence. He didn't walk for attention. He walked because men like him don't stand still. They carry on not because they have to, but because they made a promise long ago. And real promises are never broken. In the weeks that followed, Ethan Marshall's routine didn't change, but the world around him did. Each morning, just after sunrise, he made his way through the outskirts of town in that same steady rhythm. People began recognizing him now. Not from any speech, not from any plaque, but from a silence that had echoed louder than a protest. A silence the town couldn't forget. The high school invited veterans to share their stories in history classes. Ethan didn't attend. But a week later, an unmarked envelope arrived in the mail. Inside was a handwritten letter detailing a rescue operation in Laos, 1970. No name, no flourish. Just coordinates, unit numbers, and the names of 6 men who made it home. It was framed and hung in the school's main hallway, where students now stopped to read, not just walk past. At Lou's place, the diner, something remarkable happened. One crisp Tuesday morning, a young man in his 20s, barely old enough to rent a car, entered with an unusual stillness. He wore a clean polo shirt and jeans, but his eyes were trained, his back straight. A few minutes later, 11 more followed. It was the SEAL team, returning, not to make a statement, not to be seen. They came to sit, without a word. They filled the booth surrounding Ethan, who looked up from his coffee, met the eyes of the youngest among them, and gave the smallest nod. "If it's all right, sir," the young man said. "We'd like to sit with you." Ethan nodded again. For the next hour, the diner was quiet. Customers stopped speaking. Waitstaff moved gently. Nobody wanted to break the moment. No one asked questions, and no one dared intrude. They just watched. There was no toast raised, no applause. But the feeling in the room was unmistakable honor, sitting shoulder to shoulder with humility. Outside, someone snapped a photo through the fogged glass, a simple moment of shared peace between generations of warriors. That image would quietly make its way across the internet, titled only "The Booth." At the gun shop, a new section was created not for merchandise, but for memory. A rotating display featuring service stories sent in from local veterans. Above it hung Ethan's photo, along with the M14 he never got to hold, but now stood mounted in polished oak. With a plaque underneath, he never asked for a second chance. We gave it anyway. Even Connor, the young clerk who had laughed that first day, returned to the shop, this time as a visitor. Not an employee. He stood before the photo for nearly 10 minutes, eyes wet, lips sealed. Then, without a word, he left behind his grandfather's Korean War patch. That's how the town began to heal, not through speeches or ceremony, but through small gestures of respect. And all the while, Ethan Marshall remained unchanged. Except for one thing. When people looked at him now, they didn't look away. They nodded. And he nodded back. They say some stories fade with time, but not this one. Because what happened in that small gun shop wasn't just a moment, it was a reckoning. The kind of story that doesn't end when the last man walks out the door. Ethan Marshall never became a headline. He never sat for interviews or accepted speaking engagements. When his name began trending quietly across veteran forums and community boards, he didn't respond. He didn't need to. His life continued the way it always had: early mornings, quiet walks, black coffee, And yet, everything around him was different. The townspeople had begun to understand that honor doesn't wear a name tag, that respect isn't earned by talking about what you did, but by living in a way that doesn't demand thanks. And thanks to the Navy SEALs who walked silently through those shop doors, the message had been received. Local schools began including Ethan's rescue letter in their history curriculum. Veterans who had once felt invisible came forward with their own untold stories. A mural was commissioned on the side of the gun shop, painted in grayscale, showing a silhouette of a man walking away from the viewer, flanked by 12 shadows. No names, just a single phrase for the ones who never asked to be seen. The shop itself evolved into something more than retail. It became a place of memory, a room where silence was respected, where laughter was replaced with reverence, and where people entered not to buy, but to remember. Strangers began leaving tributes, challenge coins, old medals, handwritten notes folded neatly under rocks. And near the door, someone placed a small wooden bench, carved simply with the word "listen." Because that's what it had all been about, listening to what wasn't being said. The story made its way across the country not because it was loud, but because it was quiet in a way the world had forgotten how to be. There were no marches, no slogans, no hashtags trending globally, just 12 men who reminded a town, and then a nation, of a simple truth. You don't mock history, you stand for it. And the man at the center of it all, Ethan Marshall, never changed his path, never raised his voice, never asked for anything. But the world around him slowed down just enough to notice. And in that noticing, something was restored not just for him, but for every veteran who had ever walked quietly into a room and been overlooked. Sometimes, the most powerful stories aren't told at all. They're carried, one step at a time, one nod at a time, one act of honor done in silence that echoes for generations. The story of Ethan Marshall and the 12 Navy SEALs reminds us of something our fast-moving world often forgets. Respect isn't loud. It's not earned through social media profiles or decorated speeches. It's shown in silence, in presence, in standing for someone when they no longer ask to be seen. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. We share real, untold stories that deserve to be remembered, just like Ethan's.